Well, as I said, most people have heard of the grief curve.
Yeah.
And so I kind of do help, I do spend some time just sort of working on that to the point of what that person's understanding is already. And often I offer a slightly different perspective because, as I said, there has been some research around grief and bereavement. So there are a number of different sort of models and ways that you can look at this.
Hello and welcome to Walk the Talk, our version of a podcast where you walk, if you want to, while we do the talking. So if you're up for it, plug in your earphones and listen while you take us on a walk. Use this time to move your body and nourish your mind. I'm Sarah Mayo, one of the co-founders and trainers at Point 3 Wellbeing, and I will be hosting this episode of our Walk the Talk, the next in our series aimed at HR professionals, business leaders, and anyone interested in the mental health and well-being of people in the workplace. So, on to today's conversation. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by Gemma Bullivant. Gemma is a specialist in grief coaching and training, helping individuals to positively address and recover from all forms of traumatic change and loss, including bereavement, redundancy, and divorce. And prior to that, she was a senior HR business leader. Welcome, Gemma.
Hello, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
So the topic of grief and how to manage grief in the workplace is a subject that we are being asked more and more to support our clients with. So we felt it an important topic to shine a spotlight on in our own podcast. So before we get into today's conversation, it is important to acknowledge upfront that this is a sensitive subject that we're going to be discussing today. So listeners, please do take care of yourself throughout and after. So let's get started. Gemma, please can you give an overview of your professional and personal experience as it relates to grief and share why you feel this is such an important subject for us to be discussing in the workplace today?
Yes, absolutely. Well, as you mentioned, my kind of career history was in HR, and I was a senior HR leader before going onto the independent journey of my career. And to put it simply, whilst I was in quite a senior HR role, my mum died very suddenly. And that whole bereavement experience has shaped quite a large aspect of what I now do. At that time, I was basically figuring out how I needed to kind of look after myself and work through grief recovery in relation to what happened. And my manager at the time actually offered me coaching. And I thought that was quite an interesting avenue to explore. I naturally kind of went to coaching, and I can't really explain why. I just kind of was instinctively drawn to that. And at the same time, I had also kind of decided I would get some formal coaching training myself.
Right.
And so almost alongside each other, I can't remember the exact timings now, but the sort of the world of coaching and the world of bereavement sort of coexisted.
Mm-hmm.
And I found the approach in coaching to really help me. I found it really helpful for my own experience. And I chose then to specialize in grief, bereavement, and loss, and that whole impact of loss on us emotionally as part of my kind of coaching expertise. And I do a whole range of other things, but in relation to grief and bereavement, I do spend quite a bit of my coaching time now helping people with all types of change, alter the impact of all types of changes, as you've mentioned. So that's kind of then led me to where I am now, which is, at times really helping people to either navigate their own personal experience, or helping HR leaders to really think about what they can do to better support grief and bereavement in the workplace. And there's sort of two angles of what I do now.
Well, thank you. And thank you for sharing a little bit about your own personal journey as well. So I guess my first question to you, Gemma, as a starting point, well, you've mentioned change there. How do you actually define grief?
Well, grief is normal and natural. First up, it's incredibly normal and natural. We all, unfortunately, are going to experience this or already have in some way. And in a very kind of simplistic term, grief is that normal and natural response that we might experience to any unforeseen or unwanted change in our lives. And I think this is a really interesting concept to sort of for us to understand, because we often try to sort of, compartmentalize grief and bereavement away from other forms of change. And actually they are very, very similar. The reactions that we might experience to any change are effectively grief responses. And there's a sort of obviously a bit of an intensity scale to how they might impact us, but they are very, very similar. And often that can really help people to understand the experience and navigate the experience. The other thing that I'm sure we'll touch on in our conversation, but I want to sort of call out here and now, is how unique anybody's reaction might be, and including our own, because whilst we try to constantly find patterns, to constantly try to sort of understand kind of general experiences and understand things in that way, it's actually more helpful for us to acknowledge and then understand that our experience is very different to the next person's. Our experience now could well be very different to a previous experience. So in the moment, our responses are incredibly unique and informed by a whole range of things that I'm sure we'll talk about.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a very important point to really highlight early on, how very personal and unique the experience is person to person. So can you share more on the different types of grief? Again, we've mentioned a few already, and the process that we go through when we are grieving, because I know that I used to think it was a linear process, but I now don't. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, as you mentioned, and I've sort of also said, it is not necessarily about one particular type of loss. Grief can and does occur across a range of different types of change and loss. You've mentioned a few there that are quite common in terms of both bereavement, but also redundancy. There's kind of divorce or sort of significant relationship changes, but there's actually 40 plus significant life events. The Holmes Rahe scale, if you wanted to ever Google that, is effectively a list of these kind of big, significant, life-changing events that might actually be connected to stress. And death, divorce, moving house is the sort of the apocryphal one that we're often familiar with, but it's apocryphal for a reason. We talk about these things. These are big upheavals in our lives, and they evoke a grief response. The question about whether it's linear is a really interesting one, because there's quite a lot of research on grief, but not enough. I'll put it out there. In my opinion, there isn't enough on it yet. But one that's really stuck in people's sort of minds is the grief curve. Now, the grief curve, if you've heard of that, it's sometimes talked about as the change curve because it's been adapted in relation to organizational change. The grief curve comes from work done by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who it was in the 60s and was actually working with terminally ill patients and observing the emotions and the experiences that were sort of, showing up in that setting. So immediately it's not really to do with the sort of the grief as we would sort of consider, it was to do with actually kind of people in that setting, which is still grief because it's, as I've mentioned, it's a significant or traumatic change. But it's interesting to me how it has kind of morphed into this stages of grief kind of idea, where on the one hand, we start on the left-hand side of the curve, and it's represented in a curve, which immediately suggests it might be linear, that we're going to potentially feel shock, perhaps denial, anger. And then as we move through the curve, we might start to kind of move towards, some sort of acceptance kind of idea on the other side of the curve. What actually happens isn't a linear experience at all. And I would say the vast majority of us would attest to this. We don't move through this in a linear way. And so what I have mixed feelings about the grief curve, because I talk about it quite a lot because it is so well known.
Yeah.
And I talk about it because it does help us to really flesh out some of those kind of emotions and really start to sort of really focus on some really diverse, conflicting emotions. You might have guilt, you might have anger, you might actually have kind of relief, you might have, there's so many emotions that might show up. So if nothing else, it helps us to just understand those a bit better. But because it's a linear diagram, it gives, and people have adopted it into stages of grief. It gives us this impression that if that's not our experience, we're doing it wrong. And that's just so unhelpful, because actually it isn't a linear experience. Yes. And in fact, Kubler-Ross herself was quoted in sort of, follow-up kind of, work as sort of saying, in hindsight, she almost regretted representing it as a curve, because she was quite clear that it wasn't a linear experience. And my interpretation of that was, well, it was kind of like just an aggregate of everybody's experiences plotted on a graph, that if you looked at the scatter points, they would be all over the place for people. And she sort of found the curve in there as a sort of a simple representation of a typical journey, but the typical journey actually zigzags in a very chaotic way.
And I know we're going to come to talk a little bit more about sort of tools and techniques and ways to look at how we manage our own grieving experience. But you've mentioned stress a couple of times there, and I'm keen early on to mention the subject of mental health. Of course, that's something that we are very focused on at point 3, but how it relates to grief, how they overlap. In our mental health first aid training, we refer to mental health as a spectrum, where we can move about it at any point in time, up and down, left and right. The left and right is the sort of more clinical scale, from diagnosis through to no diagnosis. But the vertical scale is something we have more of an influence on, in terms of how we move perhaps back up, depending on what sort of support we get for ourselves. But what can push us down to poor mental health, is things that go on in our life. So of course, here we are talking about grief change, bereavement. So it's quite clear that grief will impact our mental health and how we think, feel and behave, and certainly then how that will impact our work lives as well as of course our home lives and our relationships. So can you provide any extra sort of thoughts or thinking on how grief and mental health relate, perhaps when it comes to either of the scales, maybe the clinical one or the vertical one?
Sure. I think it is critical to connect the experience of grief and bereavement and our own awareness and where we might be on that mental health scale. And almost sort of dispel any kind of idea that the grief and bereavement is somewhat sort of separate to all of that, because actually we are human beings. Everything goes into the same bucket. And to reference a different tool in the mental health world is one that I use very, very regularly with grief coaching, which is the stress container. And that really, for me, powerfully represents that the taps that are going into that stress container are all the stressors in the world, that sort of water, that water filling up, and grief, a grief event, to sort of use a fairly generic term, but anything that might be attributed to that, whether that's a death, whether that's bereavement, whether that's redundancy, whether it's a relationship breakup, or any of the other those significant life events that I mentioned before, they're all this water going in to the container. And what grief clients often say to me is that they're quite confused by how they're feeling about something that's happened that is perhaps a bereavement. So you might think, well, that's understandable, but without necessarily acknowledging that death or bereavement has gone into an already very full bucket. And actually that can really be the sort of the tipping over when that has accumulated to such a degree. So without going into too much on that, because you've got loads of great stuff on that already, it's the starting point of just saying, look, let's just take a step back and think about how that grief experience that we're talking about now relates to everything else that's been going on that you might think is in that container for you. And that's also in relation to the continuum that you've mentioned, that spectrum, because, if, for example, you already have some pre-existing mental health conditions, or you have a history of mental health, and diagnoses of mental health conditions in the past, even if it's not current, that could be effectively a kind of a trigger. The grief could be a trigger in relation to that. If you don't, it could be a trigger that actually happens for the first time and takes you completely by surprise and sort of sends you kind of further down that continuum than perhaps you feel you've experienced in the past. And so I think that this whole idea that it all kind of goes into the same bucket is a really good starting point for then understanding where you are in that continuum, where you are right now. If you are, the challenge is really understanding kind of, truly where you are in relation to kind of, what you might expect to experience. So, deep pain, lots of very kind of, I guess, uncomfortable, painful, a kind of a whole mishmash of really difficult emotions. It doesn't necessarily mean you are constantly sitting sort of in that part of the continuum. But if you're stuck there, then that's perhaps a sign that you need to sort of also think about that. But unfortunately, it's not an exact science. That's where you need to start kind of getting a mixture of other support. So yes, I think just to sort of recap on that, I think we've got the mental health continuum, the spectrum on the one hand, but we've also got kind of one of the ways in which we can understand that ourselves being that stress container that sort of just helps us recognize that this has gone in on top of a whole range of perhaps other things. So if our capacity in that container is somewhat is limited for all sorts of reasons, that's going to be a real indicator that we need to kind of really focus on not just the grief itself, but what else is going on in that container that might give us a better capacity to work through the bereavement.
Sean here from Point 3 Wellbeing. Just quickly jumping in to say a big thank you for listening to this podcast. If you want to find out a bit more about Point 3 Wellbeing and how we support people in the workplace to stress less and smile more, then head to point3wellbeing.com or drop us an email to b_well@point3wellbeing.com. That's all from me. Back to the conversation.
And to complete that stress response cycle,
Yes.
to release stress from the container.
Yes,
I think that's really, really helpful way to think about it. So I do want to sort of move now to talk about ways that we can support ourselves, and obviously again recognizing that everyone is different and therefore is going to experience grief differently. But if we think about fundamentally what's going on and can view it through that stress container, I think that's quite helpful. So what tools, I mean, we can talk a little bit more about the stress container perhaps, but what other tools and techniques do you use to help coach people through their grief process?
Well, as I said, most people have heard of the grief curve.
Yeah.
And so I kind of do help, I do spend some time just sort of working on that to the point of what that person's understanding is already. And often I offer a slightly different perspective because, as I said, there has been some research around grief and bereavement. So there are a number of different sort of models and ways that you can look at this. The one I find the most helpful is called the dual process model. And this is this idea that effectively we're in two modes, as the name suggests, dual process. We're sort of in, broadly speaking, two modes. So I already like its simplicity. The first mode, which is on the left-hand side of the model, is the grief experience itself. It's the painful side of the equation, if you like. It's those challenging, painful kind of experiences. It's the sort of the where you would imagine you are truly grieving. When you kind of use those sorts of terms. So that's the left-hand side. The right-hand side is called the restorative side. Now, the restorative side is anything and everything from kind of getting on with life, because of course we are doing that. Grief takes a long time for us to kind of, work through and recover from, typically. And life doesn't stop whilst we're doing that. But it's also restorative in the sense that we can't spend all of our time on the left-hand side. It's not healthy. We don't have that capacity. Our stress container is just going to overflow if we're not, releasing that water, regularly. So the restorative side of the model is there to sort of help us to recognize that life, we still attend to things to do with life. We still have jobs to hold down. We still have families. We still have other things going on in our lives. But also it is okay to step away from the painful grief at times that we need. And that zigzag is the representation on this model that I think really perfectly describes the experience. At the start, when it's quite close to the bereavement kind of, coming into our lives, we're probably a little bit hurled left and right on this model. It's that kind of those waves of grief that we often sort of hear, or we may have experienced ourselves, that kind of almost involuntary hurled from one side to the other. It sort of triggers happen, you hear some music, somebody just, or just something just happens, memories come flooding back, and we feel very overwhelmed by those emotions, those painful kind of emotions. But as we become a little more kind of, I guess we're sort of working through, when we've spent enough time in both sides, we can start to more mindfully move ourselves in those zigzags. We can decide in our own way that we are going to spend some time on the painful side. I'm going to, whether that's working with a coach, working through some kind of, activity to work on the grief, or whether it's just your own sort of decision, I'm going to spend a couple of hours in the place that I used to go to with my loved one, or I'm going to sort of just do something that actually means I'm in that memory quite specifically, whatever it might be. And there's a whole host of different sort of examples. The important point is that you are still zigzagging. You are still kind of doing, but the idea is that you're doing it more mindfully.
Yeah, so it's that awareness and understanding where you are on which side.
Yes.
And sort of taking almost a little bit of control and going, it's okay, I'm here, and I'm going to, be mindfully here until I'm on the other side, or I might need to help move myself to the other side at some point.
Yes. And the other thing that I think is really helpful about this model is this permission that the restorative side gives you to step away. It's okay to step away. Actually, we need to step away just to give our bodies a time to relax, and so on. It's not disrespectful. It doesn't mean we're not grieving. It doesn't mean any of those things. My mum died a couple of weeks before Christmas. And clearly that, that whole first, I'd say actually the first sort of year was pretty intense, but clearly that for the first few months was very intense. And New Year's Eve, I can remember, sort of almost being scooped up by some friends for New Year's Eve and doing something that was not too confronting, but spending New Year's Eve with them and having a few drinks and, not pretending it hadn't happened, but it was just an example of that, being in that restorative zone at that time, even though clearly I still had an awful lot of time to spend on the other side during that time.
I suppose I just want to ask a question there, because if we're not aware of this dual process model, we might, find ourselves in the restorative place because that's natural for us to zigzag there. But without the awareness, we might add a whole load of guilt to the experience and go, oh, this isn't right. I shouldn't be enjoying myself here. So to know that this is an important part of the process, and that's, I think hopefully is really helpful for people.
Yes, and that's one of the reasons I love this model, because what we tend to do during grief is pile a whole load of other unhelpful emotions that we just don't need, or that just don't help us. And guilt is a very, very common one, and can be very derailing, or it's just adding more water to our bucket. So it's just more for us to deal with, and we don't really need it. So if we can sort of turn that tap off before it's even there by saying, look, we need to be restorative. We know that from all of our other mental health awareness, that actually it's a very important part of us kind of managing our well-being, being kind of really clear about kind of what we need, and how we can help ourselves. Then my decision, and possibly wasn't particularly my decision, because I was sort of in a bit of autopilot at the time, but that New Year's that I referred to was I imagine a decision, but was I could have done a whole range of other things with that New Year's Eve. But that was the one that happened. I did choose that because I could have, I'm an adult, I could have said no. But it was a way in which I could at least just spend that time in a mindful way. Now, at the time, I was not aware of the dual process model. But I didn't particularly feel guilty at the time, because I kind of, I suppose, was probably starting to already tune into some of these ideas. But so many people might well have done. And you know, that there's just a sort of, there's a real kind of there's a real release, I think, or at least a sort of a sense of ease that we maybe wouldn't have had if we know that actually that's actually quite a natural part of who we are and how we process things.
So you talk people through the dual process model, you give them tools to so they can identify where they are, and to understand that it's a natural process and you are going to zigzag back and forth. And I suppose, if importantly, if you find yourself kind of stuck on that left-hand side, the really grieving side, to maybe be able to identify that and to have those good coping strategies in place to help move you back into the restorative side.
Yes, and awareness really is key, because I think with most things to do with self-development, you know, you need to start with awareness before you can build any understanding around what you've become aware of. So that kind of, but often they do coexist. So that kind of, you know, I encourage people to really think about, you know, the models that I've shared, and sort of how that relates to them. What do they connect with? And invariably, in my experience, people have connected with the dual process model without too much question. That it's actually given them that helpful kind of, you know, understanding of their experience, so that they can start to move towards that more mindful zigzag and away from the involuntary zigzag that I mentioned. The other thing that I do, which is related to awareness, is to really open up the conversation around all the different ways that grief shows up in our lives. And this relates to stress as well. But it draws on actually quite a lot of work that I did, because I did a psychology master's as well. And in that psychology master's, there's a real kind of, there's a really interesting area that talks about the multi-dimensions of flourishing. Now, if you apply the multi-dimension of flourishing to the multi-dimension of grief, it's one of the same, which is that we basically have a sort of a physical awareness, in terms of, you know, being the best version of ourselves. We have an emotional awareness, we have a cognitive awareness, and we have a social awareness. And so when you put the lens of grief onto that, which is something that I've developed a tool, a multi-dimensions of grief tool, which is based on those principles, is let's just understand what's going on for you physically. How are you sleeping? How you know, what's your appetite like? How, you know, how are you feeling? Are you kind of, you know, are there physical symptoms? And there will be, because most people, you know, have, you know, there's a physical manifestation of grief. One of mine, interestingly, was a real knot in the stomach. It almost felt like a hairball. And no client has sort of described anything kind of like that to me. And I don't like to prompt, you know, my own experience on other people, but over the time I've not actually come across people who have experienced the very specific experience that I had, which was this hairball that I felt like I just needed to release out of my body. You know, I needed to sort of get rid of it. But that was one of the physical kind of manifestations for me that was really clear. as well as some of the other ones around sleep and appetite and so on. But physical, it's not uncommon to get really clumsy. It's not uncommon to kind of pick up kind of, bugs and things, just like, you might expect when you're physically run down. The second is emotional, and we've talked quite a lot about that already, but that's where I start to kind of use some of the other things that we've talked about, like some of the emotions on the grief curve, like kind of just really tuning into how you're feeling, what's going on. Let's push through some of the assumptions. Let's not try to imagine how we should be feeling. Let's just really tune into how we are actually feeling. And any and every emotion is valid, because it might be that some of those emotions are coming from the right-hand side and some are coming from the left-hand side of that particular grief model, the dual process model that I mentioned. But what are your emotions? What are you thinking? What's going on cognitively? What are some of the sort of messages that you're sort of telling yourself? They might be kind of triggered by kind of your learnings on, what you've been told to expect when you're grieving, and what you're starting to sort of really absorb those a little more. Or, have you got some kind of inner critic kind of types of voices going on? But what are your thoughts? And then the social is kind of what's going on around you, the classic kind of radiators and drains in terms of friends. What are your kind of colleagues, kind of, who's helping you, who's hindering you, what does that social network look like, and what do you need from it? So a little bit like the New Year's Eve example that I gave, that actually was a really helpful social network, and that would have been an example I would have given if I'd been sort of working through this audit, this sort of multi-dimensional audit, to kind of really help to identify, yes, I'm actually now really quite aware that was a very helpful thing for me to do. I've only got that awareness from reflecting on it myself, but that's the sort of thing. Once you understood that, you've effectively painted a bit of a picture of your unique grief experience that we mentioned right at the start, which is that everybody is different. Everybody's experience is different. There is no blueprint for any particular type of grief or any particular type of response to a traumatic change or an unwanted change. And therefore, once you've got that, you can then start to really think about how you want to address some of those things. What's going on for you? What do you want to change that's in there? Whether it's physical, things that you can do to improve your sleep, whether it is, things to do to sort of start to really think about what triggers certain emotions and so on. But getting that kind of that awareness is, and then understanding what you're looking at, is then the sort of the precursor to sort of step 3, if you like, which is starting to make a plan of action to address those little components, gradually or significantly, depending on what you need.
One by one.
Yeah,
I think that is super helpful and very kind of easy to kind of visualize. Picking up on one of the elements there that you talked about, the social side of things, keen to now move on to discuss how we might support each other in the workplace. This is an important area, I think, because perhaps you are a manager or a colleague who has little sort of personal experience of their own grief to draw upon, and of course, yes, I know it's all different, but the underlying emotion is the same. But you want to support as best as possible. What advice do you have for people, what to say, what not to say, when you're supporting someone at work who is grieving? I know it's a big that's a big question, but there are some things, and I think almost
just to sort of, reflect on that the fact that it's such a big question often means people clam up, do nothing, better to say nothing than say the wrong thing, and all of those sorts of things. So I suppose as a first point, I would say is try not to worry too much about saying the wrong thing, because grief can be a very isolating experience, and anyone who's experienced it might connect with that. Because people do respond in different ways, but generally speaking, don't know what to say. And when you don't know what to say, often you say nothing. And then that means that you've got even greater distance, and you're not really being that supportive, because you're basically avoiding the topic, you're disconnecting. And actually what we need is connection, because it is one of the, that social quadrant is one of the dimensions of flourishing. So we need that social, we just need it in the right way. The other thing I would say as a sort of a catch-all, and then I'll sort of share one or two kind of really key sort of small tips, but a catch-all is, it's not your job to make that person feel better. We naturally want to, we naturally want to comfort, we naturally want to do what we can to take the pain away, and be of comfort in some way. But generally speaking, that is the best of intentions end up with something that isn't particularly helpful. And actually, if we accept that our job isn't to make that person feel better, our job is to be with that person. Our job is to be there for that person. And if that person in that moment needs to be on the left-hand side of that dual process model, needs to have a good old cry, needs to shout and scream, chuck things around the room, or whatever it might be, that's actually where they need to be. And that's okay. And then, obviously that's then quite difficult if you don't quite know how to handle that. But in the work context, what that means is that we're not trying to fix anything for that person, but we're trying to be there for that person. So instead of trying to relate your own experience, so one of the things that comes out often is, oh, I know how you're feeling. My ex so-and-so kind of, died last year, or I've experienced this, and you start to sort of almost project your own experience. Instead of doing that, work from the basis that you still really don't know what's going on for that person. You still don't really know what's in their bucket and their set of experiences. And in the spirit of walking alongside that person, a better thing to say might be, I really can't even start to, I can't begin to understand what you're going through. But I am here. I'm very, at any point, if you want to go for a cup of coffee and just talk, or just not talk and go for a walk in the park, I'm very happy to be that person. That is a better thing to say, in my opinion, than I know how you're feeling. Yeah. So it comes from those two principles of, you're not there to fix that person. You're not going to take that pain away. That pain is there. That's a reality. You're not there to fix them, and you're also not there to try to make them feel any better.
So be with them.
Just be with them. Be with them. And that's the essence, isn't it, of empathy and compassion, is not sort of pitying and that sort of that sympathy, but actually showing the empathy and the compassion that you can be there for that person in whatever capacity they need, and give them the agency to decide what it is that they need. So I think that's a really important one to start with. The other is to, I guess, just notice. We've talked a lot about awareness, but actually just take a moment to sort of notice how they are and what they might need, and sort of check in with them in that way. So if you understand that they're on a zigzag, then it might be that we can spot where they are on that zigzag. So if they're in that sort of restorative mode, then they might be up for, a cup of coffee. If they're sort of not in that restorative mode, it might be an open offer for a cup of coffee, but it's fine if you don't feel like it, because maybe they want to be kind of on that left-hand side, or need to be at that particular moment. So noticing what they might need is also really, really key. And the third thing I would say is, if it's possible to, is to try to check in with what they do want. And this is all around, if somebody has died or someone has experienced something quite traumatic, do they want to talk about that person? Or does that not feel comfortable for them? Let them choose. Because most grievers want to talk about the person that's died. They do, even if it's painful. They don't want to sort of name the name, or they want to talk, in that way. So I think it's really important to check in, if you can, in a sensitive way, on whether they would like to talk about that person from time to time. You tell me, and I'll take your lead on that. That can be a very empowering thing for a person who's grieving, to sort of really sort of say, yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I would like to talk about them. Is that okay with you?
Well, I mean, lots of sort of super but sort of simple things there, and helpful, really helpful, Gemma. So kind of ask what they might need, notice, be kind of observant, be looking out to see where they might be on that dual process model. Be empathetic, create that sort of safe space, just being with them, and don't be afraid to talk about it. Yeah, I think some really kind of lovely things there. And I suppose also there might be some practical things that we could do to support that person as well.
And by all means, don't resist from offering. Don't take what I've said as sort of, don't try and sort of, do things for that person, but sort of do it more on a sort of making offers for them to accept or not, rather than sort of unilaterally deciding what they need and doing it sort of regardless. And sometimes the really practical stuff can be just so helpful, because it is exhausting. So that person is going to be exhausted. So there's going to be some things, whether it's as a friend kind of offering to do some shopping, or take the kids for a couple of hours, or whatever it might be, that's sort of a very practical kind of way of giving that person a bit of space, through to, kind of giving some other kind of support if it's in the workplace, around, do you want me to handle kind of sorting out all that kind of, the meeting agenda and the rooms and everything? Do you want, some really practical stuff that can just sort of take some of that kind of energy load on for that person, but without it being, I'll do that, don't you worry about it, and not giving them the option,
because they might actually welcome something like that, the distraction. But of course, everyone is different, and I think that point is important, that they have to have that agency, they have to be involved in that decision-making process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so as we sort of draw the conversation to a close, any final sort of advice for perhaps HR managers or people managers out there listening, in terms of how they might support the mental health and well-being of their people when they are grieving?
Yes, I mean, one of the things that I regularly talk about is for us to just remember that it takes a while. As we know this stuff, but it can sometimes get a little bit lost in the noise of kind of, everything else that we've got to deal with at work. And so it either means that we focus on, do we have a bereavement leave policy? And that's, the handful of days that you might get in the very, very kind of early stages. And then we sort of forget what else we need to do, and we sort of almost end up winging it as we go through it. Do we kind of help that person with their return to work and so on. So there's 3 stages in my mind to really think about this and make sure you've got the system in place or the framework in place. The first is the crisis stage. That's the bereavement policy. That's the do they need to, what are going to be their financial worries? How are they actually literally going to cope in those first few days? Is there some crisis support in place if needed? Then there's a second stage, which is transition, which is, okay, it's happened, I now need to come back to work, but I am still grieving. What does that look like? And whether that's transition support, that's often something I help with in terms of just helping that person really get their head round getting back into work and getting things kind of, back into a rhythm, not back to normal, back into a rhythm that's something that they can sort of work with. And then the third stage is effectively anything and everything else that you've got in place that's to do with mental health support generally, because it is part of that whole process of looking after employee well-being, which is, it is another factor, it's another stressor, it's another consideration as part of people's mental health and well-being more generally. And I think if you sort of think about things in those 3 kind of sort of bundles or buckets, if you like, it can help to just identify what have we got in place for crisis, what have we got in place for transition, and what have we got in place for mental health and well-being more generally.
Well, that's super helpful. Thank you, Gemma. Okay, so we are going to end in our normal walk the talk style, and I'm going to ask you, well, we call them quick fire round of 5 questions, but sometimes they don't end up being quick at all. So let's see how we go. Well, hopefully the first one will be, but one word to describe how you're feeling right now.
Focused, I would say. And that's basically because I'm very, very busy at the moment. And so when I get busy, I get laser focused to make sure that I'm focusing on the right things at the right time. And so that's really just a representation of the fact that I've got quite a lot in my workflow at the moment. Got lots of different
stress bucket.
And in my stress bucket, but just practically in terms of my kind of, my clients and all the different sort of areas that I work on, because it isn't just grief and loss, as I mentioned. So I sort of swapping lots of hats and getting into kind of different sort of frames of mind. So focused would be the word I would choose there.
And what are your 3 daily well-being non-negotiables? So those things that you prioritize day to day to manage stress.
2 are absolutely non-negotiable, which is sleep and exercise. So probably no surprises there, but I have over the years learned how incredibly important those are. And certainly exercise has at times in my life completely kind of, taken a little bit more of a back seat, and I've really suffered as a result of that. So I am now very strict about making sure that I do include exercise in my routine. And I think the third one actually is awareness. It's a word I've used a lot here, but that awareness, which is how am I feeling? Where are my energy levels? Have I been to the gym? Do I want to go to the gym? And if I do want to go to the gym, what do I want to do there? Do I want to do cardio? Do I want to do strength? Do I just want to go for a walk? But what am I actually kind of in need of? Which is that third that I think has only really crept into my stress, my well-being kind of, checklist, if you like, reasonably recently. But I found it really helpful just to sort of go, do you know what? I don't want to do a 30-minute run today. I don't need cardio today. What I need today is something more restorative or something more strength-based or something more kind of, a different type of exercise.
I love that. That's sort of being really kind of in tune with yourself and your mood and everything else that's going on, and helps bring a bit of flexibility and diversity into into the mix. Yeah.
Yeah, and it also is quite practical in the sense that, I mean, last week, for example, my schedule was really busy, as I mentioned, and I didn't really have the time to go to the gym because it just takes me a bit of time to walk there and walk back, and it's just a slightly bigger chunk of my day. So instead, I went for a run because I said I cannot tell myself I haven't got 30 minutes to do this. That just doesn't wash. But my awareness is telling me that it's going to really, I'm going to feel the effects if I go to the gym because it's just a bigger chunk of my day. And so sometimes it can really just help me kind of go, do you know what, I'm going to do that because that's definitely something that I can manage. And so that awareness is like that as well.
Inspiring. What do you know now that you wish you'd known 5 years ago?
Ooh, what a question. I tell you a phrase that often comes to mind that I think is possibly would answer that question well, which is slow down to speed up. It's probably related to my focus energy that I've got at the moment. But this idea that I think in the past, I've cranked up activity on activity on activity. And I think more recently, I've learned that productivity and getting stuff done can actually be achieved better by sometimes just slowing down. And so I really like that slow down to speed up. I find that really helpful as a sort of a little bit of a mantra and a learn that I've kind of adopted in the last 5 or 10 years.
Best bit of leadership advice you ever received?
Oh, leadership advice. Can I answer that question in a different way and relate it back to grief? Because the person this was a manager that I did have. So it is in some ways leadership related, but it was very much to do with my grief experience. And that was, don't be afraid to experiment. And what she was saying to me was, there is no one way to navigate this bereavement. There's so many different ways that this could play out for you. There are different things that you may find helpful or not helpful. So give things a go. And then if they don't work, they don't work, but give things a go. And that was probably the most empowering thing anybody said to me during that whole bereavement experience was, don't be afraid to experiment. I guess that's applicable in leadership as well, even though it wasn't necessarily leadership advice at the time. Is that okay as an answer?
Brilliant. Sounds like she was very influential in a positive way.
Yes.
In terms of your experience that you've shared with us. Yeah. Okay, final question for you. Book or podcast that we should all read or listen to?
Okay. Well, in the spirit of the recency effect of what you're listening to at the moment, I really like the stuff that Viv Groskop does. So she wrote a book called How to Own the Room. It was her first kind of book that I came across. She's done a few others, but and she's got this great podcast called How to Own the Room, which is based on that. And it's gone to umpteen series now. But her most recent book, it was released last week, which I haven't read yet, but is based on one of the themes in that book, which is called Happy High Status. And happy high status is this sort of sense of, I'm okay. And I'm okay to show up how I am, and that's going to get the best out of me and the best out of each other. And because she's quite a well-known journalist and a very successful author, she basically has these amazing interview guests on. So I've been listening to her Happy High Status takeover of her existing How to Own the Room podcast. So that was probably one that I would flag at the moment, because it's very current in terms of what I've been listening to,
and it feels relevant really to what we've been talking about today. Well, thank you, Gemma. That does bring us to the end. And I really appreciate your time and your generous sharing today. It honestly has been kind of super helpful from a personal perspective. And I really hope it will be for all those that get the chance to listen to the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's been great.
And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in today. I appreciate that this is a sensitive topic, so I did want to offer point 3 as a we are mental health first aid trainers as well as instructors. So if you did want to have a conversation with one of us, we are at the end of the email, which is on the screen now. And if you know of someone who might benefit from listening to this, please do share it on. That brings us to the end of today's Walk the Talk. Thank you for listening.